Hi everyone, Tally and Farrell here from Bored of It, and welcome to our review of My Father's Work for 2 to 4 players, a game that answers the question, can gruesome, ethically dubious scientific experimentation ever be funny? Turns out that, yeah, it can be pretty funny. In My Father's Work, all of the players are mad scientists from the same family, intent on furthering the scientific legacy and experimentation of their father. It could be seen that the overarching goal is completing your father's master work, which will take several generations of your family, but at the same time, your family's story will become intertwined with that of the local village.
Mechanically speaking, it's a pretty classic worker placement game, but it's also Frankenstein together with an app that takes care of the narrative elements of the game. And these narrative elements can and will alter kind of what goes on in the game through the actions and decisions of the players. Maybe you'll have entirely new mechanisms, maybe you'll have brand new worker placement spaces round to round, maybe players will even work together for a little bit in a semi-cooperative kind of manner. And speaking of ethically dubious experimentation, we can reveal what we've been working on here at Bored of It, and that is running shoes for dogs. Now, we don't usually do this, but we are asking if you have enjoyed our content before, or if you enjoy this video, to please consider subscribing, because our subscriber count is a huge metric for us. It's something that makes us attractive to publishers and designers, and it will make us kind of be able to have better content. Like, for example, Roxley sending us Brass Lancashire, which allowed us to do our Brass Buyer's Guide and compare and contrast the two, which I think a lot of people enjoyed. And 80% of people who viewed our channel in the last month were not subscribers. So if even 5% of those people, if you're return viewers and you haven't subscribed, that's a huge difference to us. So we would really appreciate if you could consider subscribing. And if you're already a subscriber, please consider clicking the bell icon, just so you're notified when we put videos out, as that number's also lower than average, and we'd like to bump that up. But on to the review.
My Father's Work comes with 3 different scenarios, each of which has a different core story. You'll pick which one you want to play, and then the app will tell you how to set up accordingly. The game is played over 3 generations of your family, with each generation covering the early, middle and later years of your character's life. The aim of the game is to have the most victory points after the 3rd generation, which is best done by completing experiments. Much of the game is about sending your workers out to gather resources needed for your experiments, and then completing said experiments for rewards and VP. However, the experiments have a tier system, with each tier requiring you to have completed a variable number of experiments from the previous tier before you can undertake the current tier. And this culminates in your family's master work, which will likely take you the entire game to complete. The twist is that each generation, most of your work is going to be lost along with your resources, so you essentially have to start from scratch. But you can save 1 completed experiment each generation, and you can also record knowledge in your journal, which will help you to complete experiments in the future. Another twist comes with regards to the worker placement. You have 3 different types of workers: yourself, servants and caretakers, and then 2 different types of locations where you can do actions: town locations and estate locations. You yourself can do both types of action in both locations, but going to town will allow you to do the action twice. Caretakers unfortunately have to stay on the grounds of the estate and therefore can only do estate actions due to how hideous they are. Servants can do both types of actions, but usually sending them to do estate actions will horrify them so much they'll run away. But you can always buy more, right? You also have 2 tracks that you need to worry about. The insanity track, which causes you to gain compulsions and become so insane that your servants run away, and our favourite track of all time, the creepy track. Lots of things cause you to gain creepy, and if you get too creepy, the villagers won't let you come to town anymore. As we said, the game is app-driven, which is where you'll find all of the narrative elements of My Father's Work. The app also presents players with choices and new mechanisms to engage with, and their actions and decisions will directly impact how the game turns out. Thus, the game tends to evolve round to round as new mechanisms are added.
Let's begin with probably the first thing you're going to notice about My Father's Work, the production values. It might honestly be the best produced game we have in our collection because all of it is such high quality, it oozes theme, and a lot of the components are completely unique. And I don't just mean that in terms of they're unique into this game, each individual component is unique. And this went for about $100, I believe, on the Kickstarter, and it's not selling for that much more retail. And I know that isn't a small sum of money, but I genuinely don't understand how it has this kind of high quality and uniqueness. And there is a lot of stuff in the box as well, and how it keeps that price.
Plus, going back to the theme, Restoration Games have really nailed it here. Particularly the humour of being a mad scientist and carrying out all of these weird, crazy experiments. The experiments are often tongue-in-cheek or just straight-up parodies. The story text in the app makes us laugh, and the flavour text is often so hilarious that we just have to share it with the other players. Plus, all aspects of design and production really contribute to the overall experience and thematic flavour. When it comes to gameplay, My Father's Work does not disappoint here either. Whilst yes, it is essentially just basic worker placement, the fact that you have the different types of workers and the constantly changing options each scenario really elevates the worker placement into something more interesting and more challenging than you'd expect. There are plenty of twists, such as some workers not being able to go to certain locations, or they can go there but then they're lost after doing the action because they are so horrified by what they've seen, or the fact that yourself and your character can do both types of actions, but if they go to the town they can do it twice, yet they are only one of two types of workers that could do estate actions without being lost.
There's a decent amount to puzzle out, just in the core gain resources, complete experiments loop, let alone when you have the scenarios and the things that they include into the game. Maybe there's new action spaces, maybe there's an entirely new map, maybe there's new mechanisms to engage with. And the game doesn't get stagnant because these scenarios will often give you new problems, so you'll have to think on your feet to get around them, or new ways to score points, keeping you engaged. It's very much a game where there's a lot of places you want to be, a lot of things you want to do, but you have a very limited number of workers to do it in. And it just has that wonderful feelings that some really good games give you, where you always feel like you're missing out on something you want to do, yet you always are at the same time constantly progressing.
We really like how all of these different options allow you to approach problems from different angles. And we are particularly fans of the estate upgrade tiles and how they facilitate this. These are tiles you can buy which have a wide variety of effects, such as getting you an additional resource every generation or allowing your caretaker to go off into town and do town actions due to an extensive wardrobe. The majority of them are really enticing, which makes the game more interesting, and getting to the good ones first is often a big point of conflict between the players.
The state tiles are also important for setting up for each generation, because a lot of them will give you resources, money, maybe knowledge at the beginning of every generation, and having these kind of resources on hand can be very important to getting off to a good start. And let's just talk for a moment about how devilishly spicy the fact that you lose all of your stuff between generations is. It's really fun because it means that you always have that feeling of the pressure being on, but you also get a sense of progression because you see yourself doing a little better each time from the very meager things the game does allow you to keep between generations. And another thing that's important is the journal. And here you can spend knowledge to record knowledge. But what's really interesting about this system is that recorded knowledge stays between generations because it's recorded, and it counts towards any experiments you do. So if you have enough, you might not have to pay any knowledge for an experiment, multiple experiments. And these, so already you have a good draw, right? But the second level of recorded knowledge for each type also has a very good reward. And this means you get a lovely push-pull between spending the knowledge and workers to do experiments, or spending the knowledge on workers to record the knowledge for the future.
Now, if my father's work was just straight worker placement on the same map, it would likely get repetitive pretty quickly. Thankfully, there are 3 different scenarios in the box, each one with a different theme, such as being set during a war or a plague. What's really interesting is each scenario is full of branching paths, and there are around 8 unique endings for each one. The actions and specific decisions of the players will alter the story, meaning that each time you play a scenario for the first few times, you'll likely have a really unique experience. Whilst we haven't deep dived into playing a single scenario over and over again, the scenarios that we have replayed, the story and in-game effects have been surprisingly different.
So that was good. Now on to the bad. And our least favourite part of my father's work is the narrative story element. And when this was kind of in the demo version, I saw a lot of complaints of how much text there was and people saying there's too much reading. And I kind of laughed at those people because I thought, well, it's a narrative game. What do you want? But I will fully admit that I was wrong and they were right to complain. And the issue for us isn't that there's too much text. It's the quality of the text mixed with the amount. The story and the writing, they aren't strong enough to go on for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, which they do. And to be thematic, it's written in Victorian era flowery prose, but this just has a tendency to obfuscate what the game's trying to tell you. Now, I've written a PhD thesis and read hundreds of scientific papers. I've also read a lot of board game manuals and board game content and played a lot of board games. And I have trouble trying to figure out exactly what the game is telling me or wants me to do at times. What the app was crying out for is a simple 1 or 2 sentence summary, a TLDR at the end of every text page. Just so maybe players don't want to read it themselves, so you can just tell them and it's quicker and they get the kind of summary, or because you just need clarification, or because you're just tired of reading for 2 minutes straight and looking up at the table and everyone has a blank stare because they have no idea what you've said. And all too often we found that we had only a loose grasp of how the story was kind of relating to our actions and what the ramifications of our actions were causing, which isn't great when the story alters based on what you do. I just think that if there was a lighter touch on the story, the game would have flowed better, or if there is more narration, because at the moment you only have it at the start of each generation, and for some reason it's played at 1.25x speed, or at least it sounds like it. Another area where my father's work stumbles for us is in how it gets players to engage with the scenario, or the lack thereof. Because often in the scenarios, there'll be special worker placement spaces where you can go and interact and maybe even push the story along. But in our games, we didn't find players engaging with them very much. Issue 1 is that at the beginning of the game, you're given a masterwork. And this is a very clear and tantalizing reward that you have to work towards for the entire game. It gives you a lot of points, it gives you something to focus on, and it just seems like the core driver of the game. And this means that the scenario-related fluff that's kind of put in feels like a distraction, and it also is kind of intangible in what you'll get out of it. Issue 2 is that this is a tight competitive game, and because often you won't know the ramifications of interacting with a scenario, or if it'll be worth going into it, whereas you know the worth of an experiment and completing it, you just feel like you don't want to take the risk at the cost of losing. And the third issue is that often they will introduce mechanisms that are just a more tedious way to get something that you can get fairly easily anyway. Or on the reverse side, it will basically give you a minor penalty if you don't engage with it, but the cost of engaging with it is much higher than the penalty. One example is a favorite of the game where they say, send someone here for no reward, and if you don't, something bad will happen. Okay, well, I'm going to take that minor penalty and not lose 1/4 of my turn. Thank you very much. What I think would have worked really well is if they included a base game variant of My Father's Work, where you could still have the story, but the goal was to complete the masterwork. And then in addition, you have the scenarios, but in the scenarios, you take the masterwork out of them. And then you don't have this focus anymore, so players are free to kind of wander around and engage with the story mechanisms and the new mechanisms being introduced in these scenarios. And it would have been, I think, a much better time. Now, the last thing we want to say is about the app. It's not the best board game app we've seen. It's not terrible either, but it's certainly not slick like Return to the Dark Tower or Forgotten Waters. It's a lot more Mansions of Madness style. But you never know, it could be updated in the future. So, final thoughts. My Father's Work is a terrifically fun game. It has extremely high production values and is one of the most humorous board games we've ever played. But you should know that at its core, it's pretty classic worker placement and resource conversion with a few little tricks thrown in. And that's not a bad thing. It does both of these things competently, but it's also not reinventing the wheel. Now, what you should also consider if you're interested is that it has a very high price tag and there is a lot of kind of narrative elements, there's a lot of text that's very obtuse and long, and it will certainly put people off and has.
But it's worth remembering that the benefit of an app-driven game is that it can be constantly updated and innovated. So maybe our complaints won't be there in a year's time. Maybe My Father's Work just gets better and better. And make no mistake, this is something that we have thoroughly enjoyed already. And if you enjoyed this video, we'd really love it if you could give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to our channel if you're not already. It really means a lot to us. And please leave us a comment, ask us anything you want about My Father's Work. Let us know what you think if you've played it. And I think we better go because the dogs are demanding treats.
Treats.